Hey guys, I hope you are seeing me okay now, and I'm gonna get things started here. So be patient. Let's see here. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if you guys can see me yet or not. My computer's getting booted up. So if you can hear me now, I want to welcome you to our second webinar for Epic Archaeology, and I'm very excited about tonight's lecture and talk, and I hope and pray that you are as well. A lot of really cool stuff to share with you guys tonight. We have quite a bit of information we're going to be sharing. So just so you know, we literally have about, if I think about it, we have about 3,000 years of history to cover tonight. So just so you know, no small task, but I think I can get it done. So yeah, let's see here, making sure everything is running correctly and hoping and praying that everything's working. So again, thank you for your patience, and we'll get started here in just a second and let people get signed on. And we're going to be talking tonight about artifacts from the Oriental Institute Museum. And I'm going to be sharing with you guys in just a moment about that. You're going to hear probably way more than you wanted to know. So yeah. All right. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start out by giving a brief history of the Oriental Institute Museum, and then we're going to get into the actual artifacts. And we have quite a lot to cover tonight. I'm going to get through as much as I possibly can because it is a large subject, and we have quite a bit to cover tonight, as I keep saying. But anyway, so yeah, we're going to get it through as much as we can. One of the problems that I have when we're actually here in Chicago at the museum is running out of time. I mean, I usually set the tour to go for maybe a couple hours max, but we end up going over it because there's just so much to cover, and the museum is so absolutely amazing. So tonight you're going to get just a glimpse of what you see in the actual museum itself if you ever come to Chicago. So if you are ever in the Chicago area and you would like to take a tour with us at Epic Archaeology, we would love to have you be a part of our tour, our epic tour of the Oriental Institute Museum. Right now, of course, with COVID going on, the museum is closed, as many museums and other places are beginning to reopen. But we're hoping and praying that the Oriental Institute will reopen very soon. But until that time, we're going to be doing Zoom webinars, and hopefully this will, pique your interest in actually coming on a tour with us here in Chicago at the Oriental Institute. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share screen. So hang on one second, and then we are going to get started tonight with artifacts from the Oriental Institute Museum. All righty, there we go. And what you're seeing in front of you, of course, is a lion, and we're going to learn how cool this lion actually is. So again, welcome to our Epic Archaeology live webinar, artifacts from the Oriental Institute, or of the Oriental Institute Museum, located at the University of Chicago here in the windy city of Chicago. We are excited tonight to share with you some really remarkable artifacts. And my hope tonight is that you are encouraged by some of the things that you learn about. As you know me, as you've heard me talk on videos and in other places, you know that I get really excited about this because I truly am keenly interested in the intersection between the Bible and ancient history and archaeology. And it is an endlessly fascinating subject because the stories contained in the Bible we hold are actually true. They really did happen. And we're going to look at artifacts to show that historically the scriptures are very reliable and that you can trust what the Bible says. When the Bible says something happened, you can trust that it actually happened. And so tonight you're going to see some really remarkable evidence of that. So let's begin with our museum tour tonight. And I want to go ahead and be the first to welcome you to the Oriental Institute Museum. And let me say a word about the name Oriental Institute. A lot of folks have asked me about that, and they have basically said, why did they call it the Oriental Institute? Because, you know, some people, when they hear that word Oriental, they think of, they think of the Orient, China, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Orient. And the word literally just means the East. And so it was an ancient it was a 19th century word for the East. And there's the Far East, which does include countries like Japan and China and things like that. But the Near East is closer, of course, to Europe. And that's what they call it, Near East. They're referencing Europe there. So you have countries like Turkey, Armenia, you have Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, you have Turkey, of course, Iraq, Iran, and then Egypt as well. So that we would call that the Near East. So that's why the word Oriental Institute was coined. So this is an actual photograph, a recent photograph back in the winter of this year of the Oriental Institute. And you can see above the front entryway, there is a little carving there. I believe it's architecturally called the tympanum. And what you see is on your left, the guy standing is an Egyptian, and on the right is someone like perhaps from Greece or Rome. So it's basically the name of this photograph, or the name of this actual carving, is called East Meets West. And so there's this really interesting interplay between the East and the West. And the Oriental Institute wants to bring a knowledge of the ancient Near Eastern cultures to a broader audience in the United States. And it's over 100 years old, which we'll get to here in a moment. So this is another picture. I really love the building. This building, they moved into this building in about the year 1931. And it sort of looks like something you would see from Harry Potter. It has this very sort of Gothic look about it. But it is a very beautiful building, I think, and it's got vines growing on it. This photograph I took actually earlier this year. I went to hear a lecture at the Oriental Institute. I think it was either January or February, which you can imagine in Chicago it was a bitterly cold night. I mean, it was so cold. How cold was it? It was so cold. I don't know. It was really cold. I think it was like, I think it was around 9 or 10 degrees when this photograph was taken. And I'm not kidding, like 9 degrees. It was really, really cold, but there was no wind. And so that was good, but still very, very cold. And it was an incredibly amazing lecture by Dr. Ian Hodder, I believe it was, who is doing a project in Turkey. Fascinating subject. I actually got to meet him. He's an archaeological theorist. And so let's talk about briefly about the Oriental Institute itself. First, let me just say a word about the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago was founded in 1890 by the American Baptist Education Society with a matching grant by John D. Rockefeller, and land that was given for the university was given or granted by Marshall Field, who was an early industrialist in the United States and in Chicago. This is Store Marshall Field. But of course, the name John D. Rockefeller. So I thought it was really interesting that the University of Chicago, as many other great universities here in the United States and in Europe, were founded by Christians. So this was founded by the American, and Baptist no less, by the American Baptist Education Society. The first president of the college was a guy by the name of William Rainey Harper, who was a professor of Semitic languages, and his brother was an Assyriologist. It kind of sounds like a joke there. Well, your brother's an Assyriologist. No, just kidding. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Anyway, the Oriental Institute was founded in 1919 by a scholar by the name of James Henry Breasted, who was director at the time of something called the Haskell Oriental Museum. So last year, the Oriental Institute celebrated its 100th anniversary of actually being a museum in the United States. In 1931, through a charitable donation by John D. Rockefeller, the Oriental, who I misspelled that, it looks like Ortonal, it's Oriental Institute, moved into a more permanent headquarters that housed libraries, museum galleries, library offices. Or got libraries twice. I was typing this in a hurry today because there's just so much, and I was running behind on my time. So as I was going through today, hastily typing this out, I definitely made some mistakes. Offices, so basically the building that they're in now was actually, they moved into it in 1931. So they've been there for quite a while. The Oriental Institute has been conducting research in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Israel, and Turkey since its founding over 100 years ago. And one more thing that I'll say about most of the artifacts, I would say the majority of the artifacts at the Oriental Institute Museum are what we call in archaeology provenanced artifacts. So in other words, we know where they came from. In many other museums, and they're great museums, but it's a fact that many of the artifacts, many of the works of art and ancient artifacts were actually bought either through on the legitimate market or on the black market over 100 years ago, and now they have them, and there's a big debate as to whether or not some of the artifacts should actually go back to their founding countries. So, but with the Oriental Institute, because it is a research institute with archaeology, the majority of the artifacts are what we call provenanced. They're provenant. In other words, we know where they came from. We know the context, and they have been taken out of the ground by an archaeologist working in the field, primarily through the archaeologist working at the Oriental Institute here in Chicago. So anyway, it really covers the entire Near East. This is a photograph, an old black and white photograph, obviously, of the Oriental Institute in 1931. Of course, it's a brand new building when they first moved into it. And of course, if you go today, it's interesting to see this picture and to see what it looks like today. There are several ongoing archaeological projects that the Oriental Institute is actually has been taking part of for the last 100 years. You have the Chicago Hittite Dictionary. They are actually making, and I believe it's actually complete, a dictionary of the Hittite language. You have the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, the Chicago Coptic Dictionary, another project that really interests me, something called the Epigraphic Project. And then, of course, the Oriental Institute Museum itself, in their ongoing research as well as conservation efforts with the many thousands of artifacts that they already have that are actually not on display. So they have graduate students and undergraduate students in archaeology that are continuing to do the research on many of these things. In fact, a lot of research, if you are ever going to get your doctorate in archaeology, more likely than not, you're going to be doing research at a research university, and the University of Chicago is a research university, and there are lots of great things left to be discovered that are actually still in the archives of many museums, not just here in the United States, here in Chicago, but also museums in Israel, museums in Europe. There are massive amounts of objects that still need to be analyzed and studied. This is a photograph of the Assyrian Dictionary. They actually have a display now. I'm not sure if it's still there, but the last several tours that I gave, when you get to the end of the actual gallery, at the end of the tour itself, they actually have a display of many of the actual field notes from James Henry Breasted, as well as other archaeologists working at the Oriental Institute. And this is obviously an old copy of the Assyrian Dictionary that you can actually purchase. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think I'm right about this in saying this, that if you Google the Assyrian dictionary, I believe the entire thing, if not a large majority of it, is actually online for free in PDF format. So if you want to study Assyrian cuneiform, you can actually go online and look up the Assyrian dictionary and go from there. So let's talk about James Henry Breasted, who was the founder of the Oriental Institute. He was the first American ever to receive a PhD in Egyptology. Breasted envisioned the establishment of a special institute devoted to tracing ancient man's progress towards civilization long before the civilizations of Greece and Rome. So Breasted wanted to study not just Greece and Rome, of course, they're important, but he wanted to study the foundations of civilization. So before Greece and Rome, like Egypt, Assyria, Mesopotamia, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, the foundations of civilization. Breasted coined the term that you may or may not have heard of. It's called a fertile crescent, which describes the landscape of the peoples of the ancient Near East. In its broadest aspect, 5 elements stand out prominently. A long ridge of mountains curving in an arc from Palestine through Turkey into Iran, highland plateaus and salty depressions beyond this arc in Turkey and Iran. This broad strip of arable land, so in other words, there's a green patch of land, an arc that is within this range, also that goes down in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into Iraq, northern Iraq, and all the way down into southern Iraq. And this is this arc, this green arc of arable land is what Breasted called the Fertile Crescent. Here is a photograph, or it's like a photograph of the map in the Oriental Institute. That's actually a really amazing, beautifully created map that's actually based on satellite imagery and also a little bit of artwork, so you can actually see the relief of the mountains. You can see the mountains that he's talking about there in the north. So you've got Mesopotamia right over here to your right in the middle there. You got the Tigris in the north, the Euphrates just located a little to the south. And you've got, this is where really civilization began. And then going all the way up across the arc and going down over into Israel, you see a word there, another word that you may or may not have ever heard. It's called, the way you pronounce it is Levant, Levant. And it essentially refers to that strip of land that goes all the way from Lebanon, well, Syria, Lebanon, all the way down into Israel. We call that strip of land along the Mediterranean, we call it the Levant. And those of you who are students of the Bible, this is an interesting thing, is that God, when he placed his people in the land, this is an area, the Levant was an area that was heavily trafficked in the ancient world. So he placed Israel at a place where they would have maximum influence over the cultures of the ancient world, which I think, of course, nothing is by accident with God. But here you see the geography that actually points this out. And then also to the south, you've got Egypt. You see the Red Sea, the 2 fingers of the Red Sea. Over to the right, you see the Persian Gulf. And then to the north, to the northwest, you see something called Anatolia, which is what we call Turkey. And this is where the ancient Hittite civilization was from. And then, of course, to the north of that, the Black Sea. So this is really the sort of extent of the study area of the Oriental Institute. It's like I said, it's a massive, massive area of study, and they've been doing it for over 100 years. And you're going to see tonight some of the artifacts from this. This is a photograph of Dr. Breasted in his study at the Oriental Institute in 1926, which I think is a really cool photograph. One of my favorite pictures is this one here. This actually shows Dr. Breasted there, right there on the left. You see the finger pointing to him. He's having lunch in the tomb of Ramses XI with none other than Howard Carter, who discovered the tomb of King Tut there on the right, leaning over, and another guy by the name of Alan Gardiner, who is a British Egyptologist, Sir Alan Gardiner, probably one of the greatest Egyptologists of England, aside from Howard Carter, and then Lord Carnarvon. Lord Carnarvon was the guy who funded Howard Carter. And also, interestingly, if there are any Downton Abbey fans, the actual Abbey itself that the show was filmed in was was basically the house of Lord Carnarvon. So really, really cool there. Interesting photograph. I would love to have been a fly on the wall to hear some of the conversation. You got the founder of the Oriental Institute, James Henry Breasted, Howard Carter, Alan Gardner, and there were some other ones as well. So I just really love this photograph. I mean, this is the epitome of doing great archaeology. This is the romantic notion of archaeology, but I still think it's really cool. So today, this is the lecture hall known as Breasted Hall at the Oriental Institute, in which there are lectures. They have updated it just a little bit. It still has this sort of charm about it. You've got the wood paneling, and you have a painting of Dr. Breasted there on the left. I've actually been to probably half a dozen lectures at the Oriental Institute here in this auditorium, but this is where some really, really amazing lectures have been given at the Oriental Institute. So let's begin tonight's look at some artifacts by looking at where civilization began. Because when you enter into the museum, the first place you enter is something called the Mesopotamian Gallery. What does that word Mesopotamia even mean? Let's talk about that just for a second. So you see the word there on the map, Mesopotamia. It literally means land between the rivers. Land between the rivers, and you see there the rivers that it's talking about is the Euphrates to the south, the Tigris to the north. This is now modern day Iraq, and so some of the oldest cities in the world, in fact, the first true designated city is actually found in Iraq, right there. If you look at the screen there and you see Kuwait City on the bottom right there on the Persian Gulf, and you go up sort of a little bit northwesterly, and you see the city of Ur, U-R, right below, in fact, right where the U is, there is a city that we're going to talk about here in a second called Eridu. And it is the oldest city in the world. In fact, it is the city that I believe, and not just myself, but some of my colleagues believe, is actually the place where the Tower of Babel was built, and not in Babylon, because Babylon is actually a fairly, I mean, from historical standpoint, it's not as old as Eridu. So I'm going to, right out of the gate, start with something somewhat controversial. Some of you, I know there's this, I don't want this to generate into a debate, but I know how social media is today, and I know that some people will want to argue and debate this. That's not what I'm here to do today. I'm merely sharing with you guys where I stand personally, because as we begin to look at the archaeological record, look at Mesopotamia, look at where does archaeology begin? So this question hinges on whether or not there was a global flood, whether there was a local flood, or whether there was no flood. Now, of course, as Bible-believing Christians, most Christians believe in a global flood. There are many Christians today. In fact, I would dare say that many apologists today, many very well-known apologists, do not hold to a global flood. Most of them hold to a local flood. So the reason why I bring this up is because this will actually figure into one of the very first things we're going to look at the Oriental Institute, and that is the earliest pottery that we find in a period called the Ubaid period, which followed the Ice Age. So I'll go ahead and let you guys know where I stand on this. Epic archaeology holds to a global flood which covered the entire earth. We believe that God in the ancient world destroyed the entire world with a great flood. It wasn't local, it was global. It covered the entire earth, just as the Bible stated. It seems to, from my understanding of the text, the narrative seems to be pretty straightforward. It doesn't seem to be poetic. It doesn't seem to be borrowing from ancient Near Eastern literature, although we're going to talk about that here in just a second when we talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh. But we do hold to a global flood. Let me say this. This question is a hermeneutical question. It's a geological question, and it's partly an archaeological question as well. So let me give you, I'm going to give you a very quick sort of overview of my view of this. This is a photo, of course, a picture of the Earth from space. Whether or not it was covered with water, that's the big question. And so the view that I hold to geologically is something called a catastrophic plate tectonics, big word. What it means is that in the ancient earth, the earth has undergone incredible cataclysms. The biggest cataclysm, of course, was the flood of Noah. And we see this in the geological record by something called cratonic megasequences. What is a megasequence? It is a very large lithostratigraphic, big word. It just means it has to do with the layers of the rocks. When you look at the rocks, this is litho means stone, graphic means layers. So the layers of the stone. So a very large lithostratigraphic sequence that covers a complete marine transgressive, recessive, regressive cycle across a craton. They are also known as megasequences, stratigraphic sequences, slough sequence, supersequence, or simply sequences. What am I talking about? Okay, geological evidence of the sea level rising and then falling and thereby depositing layers of sediments. This is what a cratonic megasequence is, onto an ancient rock called a craton. Such places, or places such as the Grand Canyon, are a good visual example of these megasequences apparent in the layers deposited over time. In the Grand Canyon, by the way, all 6 megasequences are visible actually in the canyon. And on a future video, we're actually going to interview a friend of mine who actually leads tours through the Grand Canyon. And we'll talk about that more later, but today we're just going to talk about archaeology. But let me just go ahead and give you the 6 megasequences. We see these around the world: the Sauk, the Tippecanoe, the Kaskaskia, the Absaroka, probably not saying that right, the Zuni, and the Tejas. And so these geological megasequences seem to indicate that the ancient earth underwent an incredible flood, a great flood. After the flood, let me stop there. After the flood, we believe that there was a massive ice age. The earth underwent a drastic cooling, and there was a massive ice age that covered the entire earth. And so humans had to live in caves. They had to make stone tools. And one of the earliest archaeological discoveries that we know about of a human being, in fact, he's one of the most well-preserved human beings that we have found from the ancient world, and he dates back to the Stone Age, literally. And there's a website dedicated just to him, and his name is Otzi the Iceman, and he was discovered by hikers in the Alps, and he is a mummified, essentially from the Copper Age. They go back and forth, but quite remarkable. And what we believe happened is that after the flood, the earth underwent this drastic cooling down, and you've got Otzi the Iceman, you've got woolly mammoths and things like that. So let's get back to the question of where does the archaeological record begin? So depending on what your view of the flood is so if you hold to a local flood, then perhaps the archaeological record is the same. I don't think it really affects your view of when the archaeological record begins, because all archaeologists have to go on is what we actually find in the ground. And what we find is after the Ice Age, humans began to settle down and become more sedentary and live in more close proximity together in cities and in villages. So there have been accounts of a great flood through history in Mesopotamia, the transition from hunter-gatherer to animal husbandry and agriculture, then urbanism, the first cities. The first cities that we find, there are some cities in Israel that date back to the Stone Age. There's one that was found just recently, a very, very large Ice Age, Stone Age settlement, Pleistocene settlement. But one of the earliest cities we find is something called Eridu. And the earliest account that we see of a flood is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. In fact, there's even evidence that it's not just the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's actually called the myth of Atrahasis that actually predates it. And there's been a lot of debate as to which one came first. Was it the Bible? Of course, the Bible is written after the Epic of Gilgamesh. So many secular scholars will say that the Bible actually borrowed or stole from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It dates to about 2100 BC and to a period called Ur III. The earliest fragment dates to about the 18th century BC, Sumerian, Babylonian. The Hebrew Bible, of course, talks about the flood as well, Genesis 6 through 10. It was written, if you hold to a conservative date of the dating of the Pentateuch, Moses, of course, wrote the majority of it. Then it's going to date to the 14th century BC. for 15th century BC. And then you've got the Quran also mentions it as well. And then you've got, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh, tablet 11, the flood tablet is Neo-Assyrian. It was found in Nineveh in Iraq, and it actually parallels Genesis 6 through 11 in incredible detail. Another very interesting discovery, it's actually in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's called the Well-Blundell Prism, or the Sumerian King List. And the interesting thing about this is that it begins with this mythical list of kings that basically came from before the flood. And then it says the flood came, wiped everybody out, and then the kingship was established again. And the kingship, get this, the kingship started at Kish, or Eridu. Eridu is the place where the kingship came. In fact, it said that kingship descended from heaven to men at Eridu. And so many of these kings, by also on this list, are said to have lived for hundreds of years. And when you read, of course, the biblical account of in Genesis 5, the genealogy list, where you've got Methuselah living to be 900 years old, well, these pre-flood kings, according to this inscription, are said to have lived 800 years, 700 years, some are even like 1,000 years or more. So this kind of puts in perspective. I'm not saying that they're necessarily correct, but there's something going on here that they're drawing from. And of course, the Bible, it has got a really great track record of being true again and again. So one of the very first things you see at the Oriental Institute are artifacts from Mesopotamia, and these are 3 artifacts. On your left, you actually have a fragment from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And if you know that story, it's the story of the king of Uruk, who was really kind of a very he was a tyrannical ruler, and the people of the city were very upset, and so they pleaded to the gods that they would do something about him, about Gilgamesh. So the gods decided to send this guy named Enkidu. I'm not making this up. You can read the Epic of Gilgamesh and know what I'm talking about. But Enkidu was sent down, and I'm really summarizing a lot of this. He was sent down to sort of calm down and put Gilgamesh into check, but he didn't do it. They ended up becoming best friends. And so one of the things is that they wanted to go on these adventures together. And one of the things they did was they actually fought against this monster named Humbaba, which is right there in the center. You see the little hairy monster there named Humbaba, who guarded the cedars of Lebanon. And anyway, long story short, and there's Gilgamesh on the right, and I'm sorry, my head is actually on Gilgamesh. It's kind of funny. Hey, I'm Gilgamesh. No, anyway, so these are artifacts from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is actually on your left there. The beginning of Gilgamesh, he's described as 2/3 divine and invincible in battle, tyrannizing his subjects. Again, it kind of just goes over what I just said. They send Enkidu as a rival. He's a wild man. He has to be tamed by a prostitute. And also, if you ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's pretty graphic what happens. But in any case, so there's some amazing stuff there, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. I do want to point you to our article at Epic Archaeology. If you go to the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Bible, you will see some really good really good information there about the similarities of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Bible. But the one thing that the scripture is there's a lot of differences. And one of the things is the chiastic structure of the flood account in Genesis. And everything, this chiastic structure points to, it's actually called a polystrophy, to be technical about it. But everything points to chapter 8, verse 1, and God remembered Noah. So there's a really, really cool stuff going on with the Hebrew account. Again, because of time, because we need to move on in the museum, I want to point you to the article at Epic Archaeology called the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Bible. Let's now talk about the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel happened very likely at a place called Eridu. You can see it right there on the bottom of the screen there, the bottom city that's mentioned. Something happened there that archaeologists call the late Uruk expansion, in which basically people just left this area. They just left, and we know this archaeologically. In fact, there's lots of books written on this. Here is one book. I'm going to go ahead and hold it up to the screen there. This is called Uruk, Mesopotamia and Its Neighbors. It's pretty thick. It's a scholarly book about this, and they write about this. But very early in human civilization, there is a massive migration of people that center around Uruk and Eridu. That's why they call it the Uruk expansion, but it very likely originated in Eridu because there is an unfinished ziggurat at Eridu, and it was left abandoned for centuries, or for about a century or so, maybe more, and it wasn't rebuilt until the Ur-3 period by a guy by the name of Ur-Nammu. And so anyway, it's remarkable. This is where we believe the actual Tower of Babel was located. This is also when writing started, when writing began as well. There's a book published by, I believe this is published by the University of Chicago. It's called The Uruk World System, The Dynamics of Expansion of Early Mesopotamian Civilization. And what you see here on this photograph or this slide are what we call diagnostic pottery that indicates the spread of the civilization. So a couple of these are something called bevel rim bowls. So whenever you find bevel rim bowls and large spouted jars that were actually used for making beer, which was an ancient beer, not the beer today, but grain, and it was fermented. So this pottery is called diagnostic pottery, and it was found at Eridu and Uruk, and then it just spreads out. And we find it in Turkey, we find it in Egypt, we find it in everywhere. We find it just goes. So that means that whoever was there, there's something that happened that caused them to expand and go away. There's also the mythology we see in the cylinder seals that's very similar, social stratification, accounting dots recorded on clay tablets. The architecture is very similar as well. One of the other things with the architecture that's not on this picture from the book is the stepped pyramid, also known as a ziggurat. We see that in so the people who left Eridu from the Tower of Babel at Eridu, in Egypt, hieroglyphics is developed, and the earliest pyramids are built on something called mastabas, which are sort of flat rectangular platforms, and then they built them up to look like ziggurats. So some really curious things going on there. All right, this slide is out of sequence, but this is actually this is actually not from the Oriental Institute. This is from the Istanbul Museum, Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, Turkey. But this does date back to the time of Mesopotamia, the time of the early kings of Israel. And this is a copper decorated panel that would have covered a massive door entering into a palace. This is an aerial photograph of Eridu today, also known as Tel Abu Sharain. This photograph was taken by the British Museum, I think it was, as well as some other organizations that flew over in helicopter to take photographs to see what the condition was. But you can see that it is in an absolute wasteland. In fact, it looks like the surface of Mars. This is what it looks like. You can see there in the center, the sort of rise in the center there is the ziggurat that was built later during the time of the Ur-3 dynasty, built on top of the earlier ziggurat that was unfinished, which is where we believe the Tower of Babel was actually located. This is actually a photograph. It looks like it literally does look like the surface of Mars, but it's actually Eridu today. Well, actually not today. This was taken a couple of years ago by a good friend of mine who is an archaeologist at Yale University, Matt Glassman, sent me these photographs. He actually got to visit the site, and it was absolutely remarkable, windy, but literally there are bricks and pottery lying on the ground. And it's not been excavated for maybe 70 years or so. But it is an absolutely remarkable site. You can see there the bricks on the bottom. Many of the bricks date to the Ur-3 period. So we're talking about the time right after Abraham left Ur. I mean, this is just an amazing place. You can see the erosion, remarkable photographs. Again, when Matt sent me these photographs and I saw them, of Eridu, I thought this looks like photographs from like the Mars rover. I mean, it's just absolutely remarkable. And let me say also, there's no telling what else is in there, what's left to be discovered at Eridu. But these are actually photographs of bricks lying on the ground with the names in cuneiform stamped on the bricks, I believe from the period of Ur-Nammu. And this is Matt. Of course, he's got his Yale t-shirt on, flexing his muscles for everybody to see. Anyway, Matt, if you're watching, hey, brother, hope you're doing well. But he's picking up a brick there. But just to show you that this is an absolutely remarkable site. It's a very ancient site, the oldest city in the world. This is where we believe that Babylon, or that the Tower of Babel is located. The reason I mention this is because at the Oriental Institute, you actually see the pottery from this period called the Late Uruk expansion, the bevel rim bowls and the large spouted jars. You see them as soon as you walk in the museum. You see the map that we showed you on the right, and you see the pottery on the left, and it begins with Ubaid right after the Ice Age, and then it develops into this Late Uruk pottery, also called Khirbet Kirak ware in Israel. So here is a chronology of the life of Abraham. Again, this is the chronology that I follow. I do recognize and realize that there are other Christian archaeologists who actually have different dates for Abraham. I am following the scholarship of a couple of my colleagues, Dr. Eugene Merrill, former professor at Dallas Seminary, and Doug Petrovich, Scott Stripling at ABR, and others as well. But we believe that Abraham, based on the scripture, based on internal chronology of the scripture, Abraham would have been born sometime around 2166 BC in Ur in southern Mesopotamia. And then, of course, you can see the dates there. Another important date to look at, we're not going to talk about this tonight, but the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in 2067. This also is important because there is right now an ongoing debate among Christian archaeologists as to the location of Sodom and Gomorrah. There is a northern site at Tel Hammam in Jordan, and there's a southern site also in Jordan, Bab Edra and Numeria, that also fit the description of Sodom and Gomorrah as well. So there is archaeological evidence of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and both of these locations, the difference is the dating of them. If Abraham's dating is earlier, then the southern site is the one to be preferred to, and that's the site that I actually hold to. So anyway, you see the dates there. This is pottery from right after the time of Abraham at the Oriental Institute. This is Ur III pottery that you can see. It's pretty plain Jane. You can see, of course, some fertility figurines that figure at that time as well. Abraham actually left Mesopotamia right before the reforms of Ur-Nammu, when he brought in and drove out a group called the Gudians that actually had invaded Mesopotamia to the north. They were actually sort of a barbaric group of people that invaded into Mesopotamia, and this king basically pushed them out. Abraham was already gone by then, and he had moved to Haran in the north, near the Amaru, or the Amorites. And by the way, Haran, when Abraham moved to Haran from Ur, you may or may not know this, but do you know how far that is mileage-wise? I actually checked it out one time. It's 600 miles. I mean, that's a long way. I mean, he moved it's in Turkey. It's actually in modern-day Turkey. So in any case, this is an actual, a picture of Ur, and that's a fascinating subject in and of itself, but just so you see there, the temple there in the middle of that is the temple precinct of the moon god Nana, and Abraham's father, Terah, his name is actually connected to the Mesopotamian moon god Nana, which some scholars believe that very likely Abraham's family, he came from a family that worshiped the moon god. And of course, God called him out of this. And another really cool artifact that you see in the OI is many tablets, fragments of tablets that show cuneiform. I thought this was a very helpful little chart here on the left that shows the stylization. So writing started out with these little pictures, these pictographs. And by the way, these pictographs we find at Eridu, where the Tower of Babel is located. And these pictographic writing migrated away from where the Tower of Babel is located in Eridu. And in Egypt, it develops into hieroglyphics. And of course, in other places, it develops as well. But then it's stylized in Mesopotamia as cuneiform. From about 3200 BC, we see the sequence of this all the way up into the Neo-Assyrian period in the first millennium. These are actual votive statues that would have actually stood in the temple area. This is at the Oriental Institute. You may have seen these statues in books or in videos, but they're literally little representatives of wealthy people. And the way I explain this at the Oriental Institute is that if you wanted to go to church and you were tired one morning, you could just basically send your statue. So it's kind of a virtual person, virtual worshiper that they're always worshiping no matter what, because their statue is there. And so this was approximately during the time of Abraham, this would have been going on. Another very interesting artifact is that this is actually a replica of the Code of Hammurabi. And I actually included this photograph because I wanted you to see the angle. I want you to see that it's a finger. It looks like a finger and with a fingernail. And many scholars have said this. In fact, I've actually asked archaeologists at the Oriental Institute as to why it was a finger, and nobody really knows. I've looked it up. No one knows why. I don't know. Maybe it's just the shape of the stone, but it certainly does look like a giant finger pointing up. So what you see in the description on the left there is actually Hammurabi on the left presenting these law codes to Shamash, who is the god of justice. And you see there, this is a large, the original one is in the Louvre Museum in Paris. It consists of 282 laws of punishments that were adjusted based on social stratification. So that's the difference between the Code of Hammurabi and the laws in the Old Testament. Once again, because of time, we don't have time to get into it, but this does approximately, it's after Abraham, but it shows us some of the laws that were in place during Abraham's period. And again, if you would like to know more information about this, then I would encourage you to go to epicarchaeology.org and check out Hammurabi's law code and the Bible. I think it's a pretty enlightening article on that. The next gallery that we go into is something called the Egyptian Gallery. You can see there a massive statue of King Tut, and really remarkable. This is a map, of course, of Egypt, and the Nile, of course, flows from the south to the north. It's of course, it's now dammed up, and you've got the first cataract there at Thebes. There's so much you could say. This is an actual satellite photograph of Egypt from space. You can see the contrast of the green, lush Nile Valley and also the Nile Delta in the north. And by the way, the Nile Delta got its name from Greeks who were in the 4th century BC, were traveling to Egypt, and I don't know how they figured this out. I guess just because they couldn't fly in a plane, but they did recognize that area was sort of shaped like a triangle or like the Greek letter delta. So that's why they call it the Nile Delta. So now you know. So if you're ever playing Trivial Pursuit, now you know where that came from the Greeks. So another thing to know about Egypt as well is that the Egyptians themselves actually separated Egypt into 2 main areas. They call Lower Egypt, so it's a reverse because of the flow of the Nile. Lower Egypt is in the north. Upper Egypt is in the south. Lower Egypt is called Kemet, the black land, indicating the rich black alluvial soil that would have been a product of the natural inundation of the Nile overflowing its banks, making the land black, rich with fertility. And then the red land was the south, and each of these 2 lands had their own god that represented. To the south, it was the vulture, and to the north, it was the snake. Now, we know from the Bible that the snake figures largely into the Old Testament. And in Egypt, it was also a big deal. Whenever you see, this is a gold burial, this is not in the Oriental Institute, this is actually in the museum in Cairo. But you can see there on the crown of King Tut, you've got the vulture on the left and the snake on the right. And these two are representative gods of Egypt. So one of the most important one of the two, of course, that was of primary importance was the Uraeus snake that indicated royal pharaonic power. There's so much. I know I'm not going to get through this. There's no way. There's just so much. We haven't even got halfway through the artifacts yet. But one book that I'll recommend to you guys, still, this was published fairly recently by the Oriental Institute. It's a really good book on the Egyptian Book of the Dead, edited by Foy Scalp, who is an Egyptologist at the Oriental Institute, a really brilliant guy. I believe that Foy was a student of a very famous Christian archaeologist by the name of Edwin Yamauchi, which you may have some of his books. But he is now working on the Coptic dictionary, and he's got a really great volume on the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Why do I mention this, and why is this important? Well, at the Oriental Institute, they actually show this is an actual burial of an early Egyptian burial before mummification. And what you see there is they would actually bury the person in the ground with their grave goods, with the pottery. And this is this is not a model, this is an actual human being. And this is, in archaeology, we call, whenever you find everything together like this, if this was actually in the ground, we would call that in situ. So we would look at it in situ or in place, and we want to see where everything's related. So whenever the archaeologists found this, they reconstructed this at the museum to show what it looked like when they originally found it. The importance of this is that what I want to bring up here is the importance of the afterlife in Egypt, and how the afterlife is important, and how sort of this myth of the afterlife sort of developed in Egypt. I actually heard this in a lecture from an archaeologist at the University of Pennsylvania. She was talking about the Egyptian gods and how some of the gods developed historically throughout Egyptian history. And again, she is basing this on research. There's no way to prove it 100%, but there's certainly something there. But the early Egyptians would bury the dead, of course, in the ground. They didn't bury them in pyramids. They didn't mummify them. And there was a certain desert dog called a jackal, an Asiatic or Egyptian jackal. And these jackals, Egyptians began to see these jackals sort of mill around the graves. And some of them were digging up the bodies in the graves and taking a bone off or two. And so what she believed, this archaeologist, the lecture that I listened to, happened is that the Egyptians so had developed this idea that the jackals were actually protecting the dead. They were so they developed this mythology, and they made the jackal into a god known as Anubis. And you can see in there a little picture of Anubis. And Anubis became the god of the underworld and the protector of the dead. Now, this is interesting because Anubis is going to figure into a little interesting passage in the Old Testament about the Pharaoh hardening his heart. This is an actual picture of a mummy case, actually, in the Oriental Institute. And I could not find my photograph, but on the side of this mummy, because I've seen it several times, there's a painting of Anubis on the side of this mummy. What you see there is Horus, the Egyptian god Horus, covering the chest area of the mummy itself. One of the things that they would do, and of course you can see Anubis on these are called the four sons of Horus. And what they would do, the priests would take the entrails out of the body, and they would embalm them, placing in these canoptic jars made of alabaster, and they of course had the heads of these different gods on them. And then what would happen is that the heart would actually be weighed in the afterlife by Anubis. And you see there, this is not in the OI, but they do have an original papyrus. I thought I had a picture of it from the OI, but I don't. So this is another picture. This is the Ani papyrus, but it's the same exact scene at the OI. But what's actually portrayed is Anubis weighing the heart in the balance against something called Ma'at, that's represented by the feather. Ma'at was also an Egyptian god, or goddess rather, represented by the feather, indicating truth, but Ma'at had also other ideas such as law and order, and you had to keep everything orderly and organized as the Pharaoh. When the Pharaoh died, his heart would be weighed in the balance by Anubis, and you can see there on the left-hand side of the screen, the Pharaoh bowing down with his wife with the white on, and they are awaiting his heart in the judgment. So interestingly, in the Exodus account of the plagues, the scripture says again and again, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. And as you move through the narrative of the Exodus, the hardening of the heart is a progressive hardening of the heart. In other words, the heart becomes harder and harder and harder. And so what I think is happening, and not just me, but other people that I've read as well, is that Moses, of course, writing the Exodus, would have known this. And he's writing to the Israelites. Where had they been for 400 years? They had been in Egypt. They would have known the story as well. In fact, we know they did because one of the most common objects that we find in Egypt, as well as in Israel, are scarabs. Scarabs were actually meant as an amulet to protect the heart. And we see these actually all throughout Egypt. This is one at the OI. I actually have one right here. There's one right there on the camera, a little scarab, and you can see there. Anybody read hieroglyphics? In any case, it would actually be placed over the heart in the mummy wrappings to keep the heart soft, and they would actually have a spell from the Egyptian Book of the Dead in order to keep the heart soft. Not only that, there was also a heart amulet as well. And you can see there's a really good chart there, a little sort of index to show you where the amulets would be placed and what particular thing the amulet was actually meant to protect. This one right here is a heart amulet. So you've got the scarab, you've got the heart amulet that was meant to protect the heart in the afterlife. And this is also at the OI. You can see there the papyrus to your left. I didn't get a photograph of that, but this is an actual little paper mache papyrus model of Ma'at with the feather of truth. This is actually another little interesting object called a ba bird, representing the spirit or the soul of the deceased. Back in the image here, let me go back here. Also notice on the left-hand side of the scale, you see that little bird. It's like the body of a bird with the head of a guy or person. There's actually two of them. There's the ba bird and the ka bird. One represents the soul, the other one represents the spirit. And here I'm reminded, the Egyptians believed that the soul actually was like a bird. It would fly away. And so the ba of the Pharaoh was awaiting the judgment of his heart so that it could fly away and go to the Sothic dog star, which was sacred to the Egyptians, and fly off into the netherworld of eternal happiness and bliss. So this is a ba bird. And again, sort of a magical type of thing that reminded them that of the soul, of the immortality of the soul. I'm reminded of Job, who asked the question, if a man dies, shall he live again? What a great question. It's a great, great question. So again, some of these photographs are out of sequence. This is actually a cuneiform, actually a pictographic tablet at the OI. I meant to have this in the earlier. I do apologize. I had so many pictures that I tried to organize, and my time is so limited. So I do apologize. This is out of sequence. I'm going to end with this. We're already over an hour now, a little hour and 1 minute. But I'm going to end with Mesopotamia and the palace of Dur-Sharrukin, the palace of Sargon II. This is a artist rendition based on the archaeology of what the palace would have looked like. And we're about to go into the throne room of the king himself, known as Sargon II. And this is what you see in the Mesopotamian gallery. You see this large winged bull called a lamassu. That thing weighs, I believe it weighs something like 11 tons. Unbelievable. It's massive. And on the left, you see a panel from the palace itself. And there's the panel. There is actually the king himself. On the right, is a little damaged, and he's, we believe, based on the inscription there, that this is a wedding party, and these two horses are given as wedding gifts, and the king is welcoming the party. On the other side of the Lamassu is another huge panel at the OI that actually contains these other royal officials. It's the guy on the left that I want you to see. This is the son of Sargon II by the name of Sennacherib. Sennacherib, of course, was the one who created the Sennacherib prism. And he's right there on the left. And there he is, a really good picture of Sennacherib. This is a closer up view of the horses given as wedding gifts. This is another scene from around, when you go around the corner of the section that contains the Lamassu, there's another large section of the palace that is in there. But let's talk about the Lamassu here for a second. Give me 1 second here. Let me grab my notes. I thought I had them right next to me. But these actually adorn the entrance to the actual palace itself. There were actually two of these. This one would be on the left. The other one would be on the right. And as you walk through the entrance, you would be surrounded by these actual winged bulls. By the way, the dates for the Assyrian king, the Neo-Assyrian king Sargon II, is 721 to about 705 BC. His capital is something called Dur-Shurukin, which literally means the fortress of Sargon. And so the Oriental Institute was instrumental in excavating there, and they were allowed to take this massive stone statue away from the site. But it was the new capital found by Sargon shortly after he came to the throne in 721 BC. He did formally dedicate it in 706 BC, but it did not actually, the city was not completed until he died the following year. His son Sennacherib actually moved the capital away from Dur-Shurukin to Nineveh. And so in any case, this massive winged bull, and I'm gonna try to find something here. Actually, there's an inscription on the back. There's a dedicatory inscription located on the back, and this is a close-up view. You can actually walk around the back of this thing, and there's a dedicatory inscription. I'll read just a couple of lines from it. Palace of Sargon, ruler appointed by Enlil, priest of Ashur, mighty king, king of the world, king of Assyria, king of the four quarters of the world, favorite of the great gods. They're all favorites of the gods, who established the exempt status of Sippar, Nippur, and Babylon, protects them in their weakness, who provides food for the destitute, who makes restitution for their wrongful losses, who established the city of Ashur, blah, 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 blah. The whole back of the thing is actually covered in this inscription, and I've got translations of the front and rear inscriptions. If you would like that, let me know and I'll send it to you. In the palace itself, they also discovered these beautiful copper-plated objects that would have surrounded cedar columns in the palace itself, and the work is amazing. This is actually one of the most amazing artifacts at the Oriental Institute, something called the Sennacherib prism or the Oriental Institute prism. And essentially, it is a six-sided prism that actually records the sacking of Jerusalem, or the surrounding of Jerusalem, the besiegement of Jerusalem, and the sacking of a city called Lachish. And the biblical account in the Old Testament and the account of Sennacherib actually match exactly. Sennacherib talks about having King Hezekiah surrounded like a bird in Jerusalem, locked up like a cage, like a bird in Jerusalem. But he didn't say he actually sacked the city, but he did sack the city of Lachish. And we know this city archaeologically. We've been there. We know that it was destroyed. In fact, not only that, but at Nineveh, when you go to Nineveh in Iraq, there's actually huge sections of bas reliefs that actually show the sacking of Lachish, in which they actually impaled many Jewish captives and beheaded them at the base of the city wall. In fact, if you go to Israel today and you visit the site of Tel Lachish, you can still see, I am told, bronze arrowheads still embedded in some of the stones there because of the fierceness of the battle. So this is a direct correlation between what we read about in the Bible and what we actually find in the ground. And as I've said before, someone has said this, I don't know who said this, but what you read in the book, you find in the ground. And again and again and again, we see this in the scripture. When we read about something happening, we find in the ground. This is another artifact from the OI. This is actually a replica known as the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. And it shows another Old Testament king, Jehu, in the middle panel there, bowing down to an Assyrian king by the name of Shalmaneser. And last October, I was in Istanbul, and lo and behold, here is a statue of Shalmaneser. This is actually at the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. One other thing, and this is the one we'll end with, at the Oriental Institute, they actually have behind me, you can see on the very top part of the wall there, this is actually a lion from the processional way that led into ancient Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar. It was actually expanded by Nebuchadnezzar. It was built before him, but he expanded the city, made it grand, imprinted his name on the bricks. And behind me there in this photograph, there's actually one of the bricks of Nebuchadnezzar in the actual display case. And this painting here shows you what the Ishtar Gate would have looked like. So this is basically a blue glazed brick in this beautifully ornate entryway. This would have been a very important entry point into the ancient city of Babylon. It was surrounded by mythical beasts. And there along that main path, along the wall, there were these creatures that were carved. So, and that's one of them. The lion that you see, and when you go to the Oriental Institute, you will see these lions, and there are several that are in museums around the world. There are some, in fact, the Ishtar Gate itself was partially taken apart and reconstructed at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. So if you ever go to Berlin, Germany, some of you may have been there, you may have seen the Ishtar Gate. Well, this is an actual lion from the processional way. And the significance of this with the scripture is that we know from the Old Testament that Daniel was taken off as a captive into Babylon. And we know that Daniel would have very likely entered Babylon through the Ishtar Gate. There's no way to prove that 100%, but based on what we know of Nebuchadnezzar, based on what we know of the Babylonians, and based on what we know of history, Daniel would have very likely been marched as a young Jewish captive through the gate there, and very likely walked right by this lion. Of course, we know that later in his life, he was thrown into a den of lions. I've got a couple of more bonus slides to share with you to show you that these lions, these are actually not at the Oriental Institute. These are actually in Turkey. These are at the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, Turkey. These are from the same exact place, the processional way. And not only were there lions, there were also these bulls as well. These bulls, these are not reproductions. These are actual artifacts from ancient Babylon. And you can see there the ornateness of the blue glazed bricks. All right. This is a statue of the OI did excavate at Megiddo. And you can see there Megiddo on the map there. It's really hard to see. It's sort of in the middle of the map. They're in northern Israel. They've excavated there for several years. And there's a really good display on Tel Megiddo there. The last two things I'll show you, and I promise I will cut this off, is they found these little statues of El and Baal. And for whatever reason, this statue reminds me, he looks like sort of a jazz musician, like in the 1960s. I don't know. He's got this little beard going on there, but you see there on the left there's sort of a gold statue of El sitting down. And then on the right is Baal or Baal. And it looks like a pharaoh. And just so you know that throughout the Near East, we find the Egyptians had a huge influence on so many civilizations, the Greeks, the Canaanites, you name it, they had a huge influence. Even the Israelites, obviously. We see Egyptian motifs even on cylinder seals by Hebrew kings. So just because you see an Egyptian icon or image of something Egyptian doesn't mean that they're necessarily worshiping Egyptian gods. It's just that these themes and this art and this design was all throughout the Near East. But in any case, this is a little statue of Baal showing us that Baal worship did happen. There are also incense stands as well. And we know that when archaeologists dig throughout Israel, not only at Megiddo, but also in other places in the Iron Age, during the time of the monarchy and the divided monarchy, what we see is we see syncretistic worship of Baal and the Baal's consort by the name of Asherah. We see this throughout the land. The thing to remember, though, is that when we find this archaeologically, statues like Baal and El, this is not normative for the Israelites. In other words, they're not supposed to be worshiping this. So some more liberally leaning scholars will say, well, you know, when we find the archaeology of Israel, what we find is they worship Baal. Well, yeah, that's what the Bible says. They were not supposed to worship Baal. They were not supposed to worship Asherah, but they actually did. And so this actually argues for the authenticity of the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, who warned against the following of the other gods. In fact, all the way back in Deuteronomy, God told them that if you follow after the other gods, then I am going to drive you out of the land. And the palace that we just looked at, the palace of Sargon II, who is the father of Sennacherib, and then we know that the Neo-Assyrian Empire ended with the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And this is a good point. This is a good spot to end this on. We have one of the last good kings of Judah or Israel, King Josiah. And there was an Egyptian pharaoh by the name of Necho II down in Egypt. And the Neo-Babylonians were rising up, and there was a battle brewing in the north at a place called Carchemish. And Necho actually sent word to King Josiah, who was a good king. He tore down all the altars of Baal and Asherah. You know, they found the book of the law. He tried to reform Israel. This is at Megiddo. And we read in the Old Testament. So Necho asked Josiah if he could come through on his way. He didn't want to fight Israel, didn't want to fight Judah. He just wanted to go engage or help the Assyrians fight the Babylonians. Well, for whatever reason, Josiah would not let Necho go through. And Josiah was actually killed at the Battle of Megiddo. I believe it was in 609 BC. And which led to then the defeat of the Neo-Assyrians and the rise of Nabopolassar and his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, which then led to Israel going first. They went into Assyrian captivity, and then Judah went into Babylonian captivity in 586 BC with the rise of King Nebuchadnezzar. So historically, what we read about in the narrative and we see in the archaeology, they match perfectly together. There's no incongruity between the general flow of the Old Testament and what we see in the archaeological record. The big debate today among scholars and archaeologists is over the dating of certain events. But that's another story for another time. All right, I got the Hittite. We didn't get to the Hittites tonight. So I am going to stop the screen share right now and see if you guys have any questions. I know that I have been going long, and I do apologize. So sorry that we are going long. So I'm going to see if there are any questions on Facebook. So hang on one sec. All right. If there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and end it now. I don't see any questions. Let me check one more time. I see that we do have a lot of folks watching, but let me just check. All right. Let's see here. Great. Just looking at folks that are coming. Nate, great to have you, brother. Pam, Parvin, and James Pitts, and many others as well. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope that this has been helpful to you. And again, we just got through a little bit of it. Is the same problem that we have at the actual OI in Chicago, is having the time, and my voice gets hoarse because there's just so much to cover. But I will ask, if you do have any questions, let me know. I'm going to give you just a few more seconds, but if you don't have any questions, then I'm going to go ahead and close this out tonight. But we are going to And Ingrid, hello from Costa Rica, being in Costa Rica. Let's see, is there any possibility that Daniel 7 could have been seen as a Lamassu? Oh, yeah. So Fiona Miller asked, is there a possibility that Daniel 7? Yes. Not only that, but also Ezekiel's vision of the multi-winged creatures. He could have been influenced by these Neo-Babylonian, Neo-Assyrian, well, in this case, Neo-Assyrian images. So yes, that's a great question, because we know that Daniel was in captivity, Ezekiel was as well, and we see that some of these creatures could have been seen as actual creatures. So let's see here. So the next event we're going to try to do one next week. I'm not sure exactly what we got so much to talk about. Maybe we could do part 2 and talk about the Anatolian gallery. And we also have some more information on the Egyptian gallery as well. So we might do part 2 next week if you guys want me to. Let me know in the comments. And so there is a lot of, in fact, at the Oriental Institute, there are, I want to say, about 10,000 artifacts, and only a fraction of those are actually available to view. So when you go through it, you're going to be overwhelmed. But as soon as the museum reopens, we are going to lead a tour. So if you are in the Chicago area, I would love to have you. And there's nothing like actually seeing these things in person at the museum. So I want to encourage you to check it out. Just follow Epic Archaeology, and we will keep you guys updated on the latest information about the Oriental Institute Museum tours. But we are going to be doing additional Zoom webinars on Facebook. Next week, we'll probably do another one on the Anatolian Gallery and part 2 of the Oriental Institute. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you for your encouraging words. I hope and pray that you guys are staying safe and well wherever you are. Thank you so much for your support, your prayers at Epic Archaeology. We're going to keep digging for truth in the Bible. And we've got some exciting things to share. I've got an article coming out that I'll be sharing on Epic Archaeology here in the next few weeks on Hagia Sophia. So stay tuned for that. Also, we're going to be on Digging for Truth television, which with our friends at Associates of Biblical Research out of Pennsylvania. We recorded 4 episodes of Digging for Truth. So those are going to be out as well, where we talk about apologetics and the importance of apologetics and defending the faith. But anyway, in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. I love you all. God bless you. And I hope you have a great night. God bless.